Chapter 11. The Resilience of the Individual. On June 29, 2007, at around 01:30, an ambulance crew was called to a minor incident at the Tiger nightclub in London's Haymarket. The crew noticed fumes coming from a car that was parked nearby. They reported their suspicions to the police, who in turn alerted armed officers and the bomb disposal unit. Later, forensic examiners secured the car and found a mobile phone set to trigger a large quantity of petrol, gas, and nails. The Mercedes-Benz had been turned into an effective VIED, a vehicular improvised explosive device. At roughly the same time, a similar scene played out in London's Cockspur Street, where another suspicious car was identified. Domestic intelligence officers, so it is believed, immediately began to reconstruct the phone's location data. It was clear that a terrorist network was responsible and at large. Today's counter-terrorist philosophy is attack the network. Phone calls and messages suggested the presence of cells in London and Birmingham. In the periphery of the network, two names appeared, those of Bilal Abdullah and Kafil Ahmed, two medical professionals working in Glasgow. Perhaps they were involved somehow. Bilal Talal Samad Abdullah was born to a middle-class family in Buckinghamshire, UK. While still a boy, his family moved him to Iraq, where he enrolled at Al-Mansur High School and later Baghdad College. He qualified in medicine in 2004 and returned to the UK to practice in 2006. Those who study terrorism are always keen to search individual stories for features that indicate a generic path to radicalization, although the existence of a single path is disputed by many, including by MI5. Bilal Abdullah explained his path as a response to watching innocent people die as the result of sanctions during the Saddam Hussein regime, followed by the violence and destruction that followed the U.S.-led invasion. But Abdullah's violent radicalization cannot be attributed solely to a blowback effect from the UK's overseas military adventures. Abdullah held deeply hostile attitudes toward those outside of the narrow Wahhabi Sunni version of Islam, including great numbers of his fellow Muslims. In a private note, reconstructed from his laptop, he speaks as a moral crusader about to set himself to the bloody work of purification. His network's primary target was London, specifically those safe spaces where people lived, loved, and danced in praise of different gods. When that failed, Glasgow Airport would have to suffice. His accomplice in the failed London attack was Kafil Ahmed, originally from India. A trained engineer, Ahmed was awarded a PhD in technology design from a UK university before returning to Bangalore in 2005. It appears that Ahmed received his training in jihadism in India. Both men were determined to die while causing the maximum loss of life. Although they had been tagged by MI5, Abdullah for downloading material from a jihadi website while at work in Royal Alexandra Hospital, and were under active surveillance during the lead-up to the Glasgow attack, it is not known how thoroughly they cased the airport, if at all. This is important because they attacked the airport on the first day of school holidays. At 15:10 on June 30th, Bilal Abdullah and Kafil Ahmed swerved their black Jeep Cherokee, packed with gas canisters, fuel, and nails, across a lane and towards one of the main doors of the Glasgow airport, and towards many hundreds of school children waiting to go on school trips. Had they succeeded in their mission to crash through the door and trigger their VIED, the result would have been horrific. Fortunately, however, only a few weeks prior to the attack, the airport installed steel bars outside the doors. These security bars, as officials like to describe them, were installed primarily to keep the expensive doors from banging in the wind. The black Jeep Cherokee hit door number 2 at 15:11 and became impaled on a security bar. Stuck on a door bar and staring at their intended victims, Abdullah and Ahmed lashed out. Abdullah threw Molotov cocktails from the passenger side of the car, setting the pavement ablaze. Ahmed drenched himself with petrol and set himself ablaze. A fracas ensued outside the passenger door, while burning Ahmed walked to the rear door of the Cherokee, opened it, and attempted to ignite the explosive material. By this point, some individuals were attacking the terrorists, while simultaneously others were attempting to rescue them from what looked to be a car accident. The situation became confused until police officers gained control several minutes later. In a well-known stand-up routine, the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly reenacts the failed 2007 terrorist attack on Glasgow Airport, occasionally breaking down in uncontrollable laughter at the sheer lunacy of staging an attack in the former murder capital of Europe. Religious fanatics, he wonders, and they don't even have a football team. His routine centers on the heroic actions of John Smeaton, an airport baggage handler who happened to be out smoking a fag when the terrorists struck, and his efforts to stop the attack by punching one attacker in the face. Smeaton was subsequently interviewed by the BBC. In subtitled answer to the bizarre question of what would he say to any other would-be terrorist, Smeaton looked to the camera and said, "This is Glasgow. We'll set about you." There is a lapse of time between an armed attack and armed response, counterattack. If the attack is on security forces, as at Orly in 2017, or any number of embassies, the response may be immediate. That is, the lapse may be very short. More often, however, Leviathan takes time to arrive, as discussed earlier with regard to the London Bridge and Borough Market attack. Sometimes security forces take a very long time to control the situation, as at Westgate Mall in Nairobi. During the period between attack and counterattack, be it short or long, members of the public confront the terrorists in various ways. As is well known, acute stress produces clear physical reactions that give the body capacity to act. For example, when stressed, the primitive amygdala instantly triggers the nervous system to give a dramatic energy boost for violent muscular exertion. In the psychological literature, there are efforts to recognize reactive behaviors beyond the body's instinctive and therefore immediate fight or flight response. Some social scientists speak of tend-and-befriend reactions, which occur later, are more sociological in origin, and are, apparently, more common among females. Freeze and fawn responses have also been studied. Such characterizations tacitly tend to assume a single and relatively non-dynamic threat. A marauding terrorist attack, however, involves multiple stresses and usually multiple waves of recognition flowing over those involved over a period of time. In that time, human behavior can be highly variable. As noted, in the London Bridge and Borough Market attack, terrorists were met with countervailing savagery. "Fuck you, I'm Millwall." Roy Larner was willing to fight, bare-fisted as needs be, against multiple armed murderers. To say that this response is brave, apart from being an understatement, does not tell us very much. Some people indeed are physically brave, but here as elsewhere, nurture and nature seem intertwined. Millwall Football Club, whose stadium in southeast London is called The Den, is famous for the rowdiness of its fans. This was not Larner's first fight. We have discussed the importance of training, and then more training, to condition the responses of elite special forces operatives. Under certain stresses, they go. These are perhaps extreme examples, but in many attacks, some people perform surprisingly well, exhibit what psychologists call resilience. Both the Glasgow attack of 2007, discussed above, and the Tallis train attack of 2015, below, provide striking examples of resilience, to which we now turn. The following section is drawn fairly directly from Mark's fieldwork into the Tallis attacks done in the course of the project, An Anthropology of 10 Minutes. In order to demonstrate both the confusion of terrorist attacks and the need for resilience, it seems better to let individuals who've experienced terror attacks use their own words, demonstrate the confusion of the attacks, the need for resilience, and oftentimes their own resilience. Bravery. On August 21st, 2015, on the Tallis train from Amsterdam to Paris, Ayoub El-Khazani attacked passengers in car number 12, in which Anthony Sadler, Airman First Class Spencer Stone, and Specialist Alec Scarlatos happened to be passengers. The following is Spencer Stone's account, the first of the three young men to react. "So, I was initially woken up by the train employee running past me towards the front of the train, and that commotion kind of woke me up initially. I didn't know exactly what was happening when he ran by. I just knew that it was really odd behavior. Just how fast he was sprinting down the aisle kind of alarmed me. And then I looked at Alec, and he was kind of looking towards the back of the train, and then he kind of had a shocked, look on his face. And then I looked at Anthony, and he was just kind of still looking up and kind of had that same look, what the heck is going on? I took my headphones off, and I heard glass breaking, people screaming. And then I turned around and looked behind me, and the first thing I see is a guy coming into our train car, bending down, picking up the AK, and he's trying to load a round in. And I noticed he was kind of something's going on with this guy. I didn't know what, but I was just he's having some type of trouble. Then I kind of looked down the aisle, and there's people sitting right next to him looking at him, and I'm kind of doing this short little scan, and I say, in my head, going, do something, give them a second to get up and react. And then I quickly realized that they're just in too much shock to do anything. So I pretty much took it upon myself, because I just thought our time was running out, that I'd make a move pretty much. And so I just took off in a full sprint down the aisle towards him. And then, I could hear him trying to work the gun again. And even more like he actually ended up pulling the trigger on me, but there was a bad timer on the bullet, so it gave me more time to be able to make it to him, which is like probably the biggest miracle in the whole story. As I came up to him, he kind of like butt strikes me with a gun, like as I'm tackling him. So I can't really see out of one of my eyes now. And we both kind of fall to the floor as I tackle him. And then, like the main fight starts. And I'm trying to grab the gun from him. And, I feel like I'm kind of like losing grip, I guess. I mean, I was trying to grab it, but I never had full control of the gun. And so then my instincts just went to what I know. And I just remember my jiu-jitsu. I was just trying to choke him out, put him in a rear naked choke. And then I flung myself to the right side of the train and kind of bashed my head against the window a little bit. I'm surprised I didn't knock myself out when I did that. And then Alec ran up as I was trying to choke him. And, he started to help me out by taking the pistol from him before he could shoot me with that. And then I started to get slashed on the back of my neck. And I had my left finger, my left thumb cut to the bone. And it severed my tendon and nerve. And, once I saw my finger, I looked over because I'm on his back now. Reviewing the sequence of discrete actions, one cannot help but be struck by the fact that everything happened within a very narrow temporal window. More simply, things happened fast. Spencer sensed a disturbance, made a snap decision, and was then racing down the aisle of a train carriage towards a half-naked man with an assault rifle. Alex Scarlatos recalls the odd effect the attack had on time and gives his perspective on the first minute of the confrontation. It was fairly obvious that it was a terrorist attack. We saw the train employee run past us, and we just looked back to see what he was running from, and there was like a shirtless Middle Eastern guy with an AK-47 standing there. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. And it was just kind of like, there's no way this is happening. And so then I tapped Spencer, and I said, "Spencer, go," or something to that effect. And then he immediately gets up and runs up to this guy. I kind of had tunnel vision, so I didn't even realize Spencer had left until he was already halfway to the guy. To be honest, I don't even remember it. But basically, Spencer tackled the guy. I caught up to him. We fought with him for a little bit. Then basically, Spencer finally got him in a chokehold. And once he got him in a chokehold, the terrorist then pulled out a handgun to try to shoot him with it. I was standing right in front of him, so I pulled the handgun from out of his hand before he could shoot anything, and then put it to his head and told him to stop resisting. He didn't, so I pulled the trigger and the chamber was empty. So then I basically just threw it, and I picked up the AK that was on the ground because I think Spencer was getting stabbed around this time. So I just tried to shoot him with the AK, but it was unsafe, so instead of messing with it anymore, I just started to hit him in the head with a muzzle. Scarla's efforts to subdue El-Kazani are magnified in his memories, but during those exact moments, his friend was fighting for his life, uncertain of the outcome. Spencer Stone expands on those critical moments from his perspective. It did happen very quickly. From where I was in a fight for my life, and, I very much wanted to kill the guy, naturally in that type of situation. If someone has tried to shoot you twice with multiple different guns and has slit your throat, you're kind of like seeing red at that point. And like you feel like the only option is to kill the person because it doesn't seem as if he is going to stop. So you've got to win. Bruised and bleeding, with his friend's help in the drive to win, Stone hooked his legs around the attacker and applied the chokehold until El-Kazani lost consciousness. At this point, the friends' memories fade into one another. Spencer continues. At this point now, kind of like we're all standing up, we're all like semi-surrounding Kazani, and we just started to punch him, kick him, do whatever we could. And now he's got no weapons in his hands, and he kind of like winded himself on me, and then we like threw him over a table, and then Alec and I kind of like were holding him by the back of the neck against the table, and we were screaming at him, "Stop, stop, stop resisting." And then that's when I saw Mark Mugulian bleeding, and I was also confused because I still had been looking for the gunshots. I didn't know if he'd actually shot anyone yet, or if I was actually kind of confused. I didn't know how he'd even been injured, so I thought maybe he got a belt with a knife in the scuffle or something, and then I just screamed, "Hey, I'm a medic, get this guy off of me," and then hold him down and make sure he doesn't wake up. I crawl over and I see blood kind of gushing through the neck, and I took my shirt off. Originally I was going to use it as a bandage to hold pressure with, but once I realized it was pressure coming from his neck, like pulsating with regard to his artery, and then I put my fingers in his neck and I could feel the artery pulsing in there, and I found it and clamped it down, and the bleeding just completely stopped, and we kind of just went from there. It acted quickly, and within a matter of minutes, the two servicemen had taken control. From the perspective of others on board, the event seemed even more dramatic. This is the account of then 62-year-old Christopher Norman. I was traveling from Amsterdam Airport. I was going to change trains in Paris and then carry on down to the south. So I was in the train and I was working on my PC. I heard this bang, if you like, and I wondered, what is that? And I heard glass falling. The Talus seats are very large, so you don't see what's going on in the rear of the compartment. Then what happened immediately is after I'd heard that I think it was the train manager was rushing back up towards the engine in the front, running very, very fast indeed. He sort of almost broke through the glass door at the end of the carriage and he was shouting something. Now I don't remember exactly what. I think it was he's crazy or something like that in French. So up and I see this guy coming up the aisle with his beard, bare chested, carrying an AK-47. Well, it wasn't an AK-47, carrying a submachine gun. And so I sit down again. I'm actually dead scared. There was no question in my mind. My first thought was, oh my God, it's happening to me. I remember the Tunisia thing immediately before it, where people didn't get up and do anything, and basically they were all shot down anyway. So my thinking was, what do I do? How do I react in relation to this? Is there anything I can do that will basically save our lives? At the same time being very, very scared. So I was kind of trying to get myself ready to do something, but I didn't know whether I was going to do anything or not. And then I stood up. I saw Spencer wrestling with a guy, and I saw Alec in front of him hitting him, and I saw the guy looking like he was trying to reach down to what I think was a gun on the ground. And I said, if there's one thing I have to do is to stop him from getting that gun, or we've had it. It was a silver handgun. It looked like a silver handgun. So I jumped in there. I guess it seemed quite a long time actually. I guess it was about 30 seconds, maybe even 60 seconds. No, sorry, 2 minutes. So 1 minute or 2 minutes, something like that. The guy stopped struggling completely, and from then on, it's history. With the terrorists subdued, and with his friend applying the crudest of clamps to Mugulian's artery, Alex Scarlata set about clearing the train of any other threats. So then I put a new round in the AK-47, and I took the AK to the back of the train, just like making sure there weren't any other terrorists or anybody else that was shot. When I got to the back of the train and there was a bunch of people crowded, kind of packed in the back, like sardines. So I just asked them if anybody spoke English, and 2 guys raised their hands. And I asked them if anybody else was hurt, and they said no. And so I told them just to tell everybody else to kind of stay where they were and not to come up front. And then I left. I went back up front, started clearing the AK and looking for the handgun. I gathered all the weapons of ammunition, put them on a seat, and then I went over and helped Spencer take care of Mark to get his shirt off altogether and look for any other injuries, and mostly just hung out and kind of talked with Spencer and Mark and tried to make sure the terrorists stayed unconscious. The third of the American tourist friends, Anthony Sadler, arrived with the train's medical kit and, following Spencer's directions, cut off Mark Magulanian's clothes and checked for secondary wounds. The train was rerouted to Arras station, where approximately 15 minutes later it was met by armed officers and emergency medical teams. The scene was secured and the tourists stood down. These individuals, who drove themselves as heavily armed terrorists, were members of a fairly rare breed on a contemporary European train, people who know what it is to experience violence. Alex Scarlatos is clear on how his upbringing in California shaped his actions. We were kind of like paranoid growing up, I guess. We've thought about and talked about situations like this happening before, that if somebody ever decided to shoot up our school, what would we do? Things like, would we try to tackle them? Just things like that. We've thought ahead about it, I guess. During a separate interview, Spencer Stone opened up this topic in more detail. I think, obviously pretty much what I described was a little bit of mental preparation, and it's for some people that could be kind of a scary thought. And they don't want to think about those types of things. And hey, I get that. You don't want to be walking around doom and gloom thinking the worst is always going to happen. But at the same time, it's very realistic. You have to prepare for situations like that, at least have thought about it once or twice in your lifetime. So, for instance, one thing that happens in Europe, which I think might be slightly different to the U.S., is that when bullets are fired, Europeans don't necessarily recognize that for what it is initially, because we don't hear it very often, because, there's very little shooting, as you can imagine, because we don't just get that many gunshots. Apart from his youth in a milieu where violence was thought, we can account for the serviceman's actions by tending to his training, both medical and firearms, and perhaps his knowledge of jiu-jitsu. But what of the others? Christopher Norman, at 62, entered the fray quickly, but he too had a sense of what was happening, a muscle memory from childhood in Kenya and time spent in South Africa. I lived a long time in South Africa, he explained, and I was fairly preconditioned to the idea that violence could happen, which I think is a rather different conditioning than the majority of people in Europe have. If these preconditioned individuals were not on board, it is difficult to see the terrorists meeting any friction. Yet, as discussed, their actions would not have been enough if it were not for the luck of the day. Spencer Stone reflected on the sequence of events and how things could have been otherwise. The fact that we ended up in that exact spot with so many different variables, the AK, the bullet not in the AK, the primer not working and giving me that opportunity to make it to him. There's stuff I don't think I mentioned during my explanation that he tried to shoot me in the head with a pistol, and he had just got done shooting Mark McGoulian with that pistol, and there should have been ammunition in it, but he must have dropped it when he shot him or in the scuffle or something. I'm also sure there wasn't a bullet in the chamber, so, that essentially didn't work for him. And then he was able to attack my neck when I was trying to choke him. As he was cutting me, he wasn't able to cut my artery, and then there's just so many different things. In short, individuals who have resilience tend to behave very differently from those who do not, as illustrated by the Glasgow and Tallis attacks. A final example comes from Anders Breivik's attack on Utøya Island. Breivik chose his target because the island was hosting a youth retreat for the Norwegian Labour Party. In his mind, he was slaughtering a future generation of Norwegian socialists. Among the large number of children, however, were two 16-year-old Chechnyan refugees, Rustam Dudov and Jamal Mavsar. The two friends attacked Breivik with rocks and brought 23 children to safety. When the incident was resolved, one of their friends, also from Chechnya, calmly smoked a cigarette. He was arrested because the police became suspicious of his relaxed attitude. It is simplistic to compare children from war-torn regions to their counterparts in extremely safe countries during what is arguably the most peaceful period in human history. But it is not a matter that one can simply pass over. If resilience is accessible, or might be surmised from past experiences, one can imagine making resilience an explicit criterion for recruitment in critical infrastructure sites, especially mass transit systems. Insofar as resilience is learned, as these attacks strongly suggest, one can imagine teaching it. One can imagine training school children and others how to be more resilient. One can even imagine the public finding this more or less acceptable. To some extent, this is happening in the United States, with schools doing lockdown drills. One can imagine arming and training more civilian public servants. One can also imagine paranoia within reason. Discussion of resilient individuals raises another issue. In terrorist attacks, violence and associated virtues come from many angles. Violence, even legitimate violence, is not the exclusive purview of something called the state. To that question, we now turn.